One quiet Tuesday morning, just as the sun was stretching over the rooftops, a single anonymous message landed on an old Sister Wives fan forum, and what it contained would soon shake the entire Brown family tree. "I'm one of the Brown kids, and it's time someone told the truth," the message said. The moderators froze, asking for proof, and were met with a time-stamped photo of a handwritten note taped to a wall. Fans instantly recognized from the show, verified. Real. Within minutes, screenshots started moving through private chats like sparks in dry grass. And the now-grown child started sharing a memory not a loud fight, not a dramatic TV moment, but something far quieter and far more unsettling. They explained how they sat alone on the stairs when they were 12 years old, their knees tightly pulled in as they listened to adults speaking in hushed voices, using those strained, careful voices people save for when something explosive is simmering just beneath the surface. Three women murmured, one softly crying. Their father paced, his clipped footsteps echoing through the house. On the kitchen table, bills lay out, grim evidence photos. A wife questioned where money was missing. Another insisted it had all been handled. Someone tapped her fingers anxiously, and their father glared toward the stairs, sensing young ears were listening. But the moment that stuck with the child wasn't the argument. It was the silence afterward, a cold, heavy silence that felt like it seeped up the stairwell and settled beside them like some kind of ghost. "People think the tension started when the divorces happened," the child wrote. "No, it started long before that. We felt it before anyone admitted it." The narrator's voice picks up as the dim memory comes into view. Hidden bank statements in drawers, receipts tucked into cookbooks, phone calls abruptly ended when footsteps approached. "We knew something was wrong," they say. "We just didn't know how big it was." The first bombshell drops. The adults weren't fighting about love. They weren't fighting about rules. They were fighting about money. The child concludes their message with a line that sends a chill through the Sister Wives community. "I didn't stay silent because I wanted to. I stayed silent because speaking up would have blown the family apart. But the truth, it was already breaking." And according to this now-grown Brown kid, the biggest secret hasn't even been revealed yet. This is TLC Uncovered, and we're just getting started. The child's confession didn't stop at that one memory. In fact, it was only the doorway into a much darker hallway. As the post unfolded, they described the years that followed, years when the tension inside the Brown homes became something thick enough to taste. They wrote about how the adults would smile brightly for the cameras in the morning, only to retreat into whispered arguments behind closed doors once the filming wrapped. "I learned to read moods better than textbooks," the child explained. "On good days, the house felt light, almost normal. On bad days, you could hear the strain in every clink of a spoon, every chair being pushed back a little too firmly." One detail cut above the rest: a binder, a simple, frayed, overstuffed binder that lived on the top shelf of a laundry room cabinet, always out of reach, always locked with a cheap gold clasp. The child didn't understand what it was then, only that their father guarded it like it contained the family's heartbeat. "We weren't allowed to touch it," they wrote, "not even when we were helping with chores. If he caught us looking at it, he'd snap his fingers and say, 'That's grown-up stuff.'" But the moms? Their reactions were different. Christine would freeze for a second whenever the binder thudded on the counter. Janelle's eyes would track it longer than necessary, as if doing silent math in her head. And Mary, she would simply step back and busy herself with some unrelated task, the way someone does when they've already made peace with being left out. "We didn't understand the binder," the child continued, "but we understood how it made everyone feel. It wasn't just a binder. It was a pressure cooker with a clasp." The child recalled nights lying awake hearing fragments of tense conversations leaking through the vents. Someone asking for receipts, someone else insisting they were handled, someone raising their voice, then quickly lowering it when footsteps approached. They remembered a night when one wife walked out the front door after midnight, keys trembling in her hand, tears streaking down her face, and another wife tried to follow but stopped herself at the threshold because she remembered the cameras would be back in the morning. That was the moment everything cracked, the child wrote. Because when the door slammed, something inside the house cracked with it. Even we could feel it upstairs. And then the confession widened. You all think the kids didn't know, they said. But we always knew. We weren't blind. We weren't clueless. We were witnesses, silent ones, because silence felt safer. And in a line that stopped even longtime fans cold, they added, every adult had a version of the truth, but the binder had the real one. They say every family has a breaking point. According to this grown brown child, theirs didn't happen on camera, or during a televised argument, or when a wife finally walked away. Their breaking point began the day they climbed onto a stepladder, reached for that forbidden cabinet, and pulled the binder into the light for the very first time. And what they found inside didn't just explain the tension, it explained the fallout. This is TLC Uncovered. And trust me, the story is only getting heavier from here. What the child found when they opened that binder was nothing like they expected. There were no family photos, no recipes, no school papers tucked between plastic sleeves. Instead, the pages were filled with numbers, rows and columns of them, scribbled in handwriting they recognized instantly, their father's. It didn't make sense at first, the child explained. Why would he hide budgets? Why were there lists of what each wife spent on groceries, utilities, even haircuts? But the deeper they flipped, the stranger it became. Each wife had her own section, separated by sticky notes that had long since lost their stick. Under one wife's name, the child recalled seeing page after page of items highlighted in red, as if they were warnings. Under another's, there were notes written in sharp, almost frantic pen strokes. Ask her about this. This is too much. Not approved. But the most unsettling moment came when they found a page covered entirely in sticky notes of different colors. Some new, some yellowed with age. Each one had a single sentence on it, written by a different wife. At the time, I didn't understand what those notes meant, they wrote, but now, as an adult, I do. Those were messages, instructions, agreements, or maybe disagreements. There was one in Christine's careful handwriting. We need to talk before this gets worse. Another in Janelle's more assertive scrawl. We can't keep pretending. And next to them, in a small, hesitant script, they knew belonged to Mary. I feel like I'm disappearing. It was the kind of note a person writes when they're trying to express something big, but only have the courage to say it on paper. At the bottom of that cluster of sticky notes was a different kind of handwriting. One the child recognized but didn't want to. It was the handwriting of the newest wife, and her note said something that chilled them even years later. Let me handle it. That was the moment the binder shifted from curious to dangerous. I started to realize why the adults argued so often, the child revealed. They weren't fighting about dishes or chores or camera interviews. They were fighting about control. Control of money, control of decisions, control of each other. They remembered hearing footsteps in the hallway and slamming the binder shut as fast as they could, their heartbeat pounding against the paper like it wanted to escape. They hid the binder back on the shelf, trying to make everything look exactly the way it had before. But the damage was done. Once you see inside the binder, they wrote, you can't unsee it. But the confession didn't stop there, because later that night, after everyone had gone to bed, something else happened, something the child had kept secret for a decade, something they finally revealed in their online post, and it changed everything we thought we knew about the Brown family's collapse. This is TLC Uncovered, and Part 4 goes even deeper into the moment that broke the family from the inside out. Later that night, long after the house had fallen into the uneasy quiet that only families with unresolved tension know, the child woke up with the kind of start that only happens when your body senses something before your mind does. They remembered hearing a faint thud, not loud, not alarming, but just out of place enough to pull them from sleep. At first I thought it was nothing, they wrote, but then I heard footsteps, slow, heavy ones, not the light ones of a sibling going for water, not the creaky, tired ones of one of the moms checking on laundry. These were deliberate, purposeful. The child slipped out of bed and crept toward the upstairs landing, careful to avoid the fourth stair from the top, the one everyone knew squeaked. What they saw below wasn't dramatic, but in hindsight, it was the moment everything changed. Their father stood in the kitchen, still in the clothes he'd worn all day, shoulders tense, jaw clenched, flipping through that same binder with an urgency that felt nothing like simple bookkeeping. He wasn't just reviewing things, the child said. He was rewriting them. They watched as he ripped out a page, not angrily, but methodically, as if removing a piece of evidence. He folded it twice, slipped it into his pocket, and continued writing on a fresh sheet with the intensity of someone preparing for a battle. Only they understood. Then came the second figure. One of the wives stepped into the kitchen, quietly at first, then stunned when she saw the binder sprawled open like a dissected truth. Her voice was too low for the child to hear, but her body language told the story. Arms tight to her sides, head tilted in disbelief, a tremble in her hand as she pointed to the missing page. Their father didn't back down. Instead, he leaned over the binder, protective, defensive, as if shielding it from her. Whatever he said next, the child recalled, it made her flinch, not physically, emotionally. They watched her pace, her hands running through her hair, her breath fast and uneven. She wasn't crying, not yet, but she was close, dangerously close. She grabbed the edge of the counter for support, then whispered something sharp enough that even without hearing the words, the child understood. This wasn't a small argument, this was a rupture. And then, in a move that shocked the child even from the shadows of the staircase, she reached into the binder and pulled out a handful of sticky notes, her handwriting, and torn them in half. Their father reacted instantly, stepping forward, grabbing her wrist, not hard enough to hurt, but firm enough to warn. And that's when the child saw something they would never forget. Fear, not the child's, hers. I'd never seen one of the moms look afraid of him, they wrote. Not until that night. The argument intensified, quiet, controlled, but carved from pure resentment, the kind adults try to keep from children, but forget that walls carry sound. And then, suddenly, she walked away. No suitcase, no keys this time, just a departure loaded with something heavier than anger, resignation. She disappeared down the hall, leaving their father alone with the binder, the scraps of torn notes, and a truth that was finally too big to hide. That was the night, the child confessed, that I realized the family wasn't a team. It was a war disguised as a wedding photo. What they didn't know then, what they only learned years later, was that this quiet midnight confrontation would spark a chain reaction that led to one of the wives' most painful decisions, a decision that never made it onto television. And in Part 5, we reveal exactly what happened the next morning and why it was the beginning of the end for the entire family. This is TLC Uncovered. The next morning began with a silence so heavy that even the youngest kids felt it before anyone spoke. Breakfast, usually loud and chaotic, felt like a courtroom. No one made eye contact, the grown child recalled. It was like everyone had witnessed something, but none of us knew what we were allowed to say. One of the wives moved through the kitchen in slow, mechanical motions, placing bowls on the table without her usual soft humming. Her eyes were swollen, not from sleep. The child remembered noticing the way she avoided the cabinet with the mismatched mugs. She always used those when she was happy. That morning, she picked a plain one instead. Their father entered a few minutes later, shoulders rigid, expression locked in a neutral mask that fooled no one. He greeted the room in a tone far too cheerful, the kind of forced brightness adults use when they hope children won't sense a fracture. But children always know. He didn't look at her, the child wrote. Not once. That's how I knew something real had broken. The wife stayed silent for most of the meal, but when she finally spoke, her voice was flat, drained. She asked him if they could talk, her words clipped, measured. Their father paused with a fork halfway to his mouth, irritation flickering across his face as if she'd chosen the wrong moment, the wrong tone, the wrong everything. He agreed, but begrudgingly. telling her they'd finish this later, as if the previous night's confrontation had been nothing more than a logistical dispute. The other wives exchanged glances, small, fleeting ones, the kind you only catch if you're watching closely. That's when I realized, the child later wrote, some of them already knew or suspected, or had been keeping quiet because that's how the house worked. But here's the moment that changed the day. After the meal, when the kids moved toward their chore lists, the wife from the night before placed her hand softly on the child's shoulder and said, almost in a whisper, "You don't have to stay in here today." Not a comforting statement, a protective one. She'd never said anything like that before, the child explained. So they left the house and wandered the backyard, pacing near the old wooden fence that had long been a silent witness to the family's arguments. The air felt charged, thick, unsettled, and then the door swung open. Two of the wives walked out, both tense, both moving with purpose. They didn't raise their voices, but the urgency in their steps told its own story. It was one of the rare times I saw them united, the child said. Inside, voices escalated, muffled at first, then sharp enough to pierce through the walls. Words like unfair, lies, and trust floated through the air, disjointed but unmistakably loaded. A crash followed, not violent, but loud enough to make everyone freeze. The child remembered watching birds scatter from the fence, taking flight in a single, frantic burst. And then the strongest sign yet that something irreversible was happening. One of the wives stormed out of the house, keys in hand, tears streaking down her face, refusing to look at anyone. She wasn't the runaway type. She wasn't dramatic. So when she got into her car, hands shaking, and backed out of the driveway without a word, everyone understood, even if they didn't know the details. That was the first departure, the child wrote. The first real one, not a threat, not an argument, a break. What the child didn't know was that her leaving that morning triggered a hidden fracture between the adults. A fracture over loyalty, over money, and over a secret agreement the kids weren't meant to hear about. And in part 6, we reveal the moment the child accidentally overheard the truth, a truth the family has avoided speaking publicly for over a decade. This is TLC Uncovered. Later that afternoon, the child found themselves wandering near the garage, pretending to look for a lost baseball glove, when a conversation from inside the house drifted through the slightly ajar sliding door. They froze, heart pounding, as fragments of words reached their ears, words no child should ever hear, and words that, in hindsight, explained so much. Their father's voice, usually controlled and steady, carried a sharp edge, clipped like a whip. "It's not about her. It's about keeping control. You know that." Another voice, calm, precise, unmistakably hers, responded, "Control or hiding the truth? You've already gone too far. The kids heard too much last night." A silence followed, filled only by the low hum of the refrigerator and the distant drone of traffic. Then came the line that would stick with the child forever. "If anyone outside this house sees the ledger, we're finished. Everyone's finished." The child's stomach dropped. Ledger. That was the binder. "I wanted people to understand what it felt like," the child wrote. "Not the drama on TV, but the truth we lived every day." The post went viral almost instantly. Fans, some who had watched the family for years, were stunned. Comments flooded in, many from viewers who had sensed the tension but had never understood the magnitude of the secrets hidden behind the cameras. "I can't believe this was happening under their noses," one user wrote. Another added, "This explains so much I've been watching for years." But the real shockwave hit the family first. The adults, now faced with undeniable proof, were forced into confrontations they had meticulously avoided for a decade. The child recounted the first in-person confrontation. The binder, once hidden, now displayed with all its evidence, laid on the table like a courtroom exhibit. Eyes darted between pages, sticky notes, receipts, and bank statements, each line a witness. The silence was deafening, the child explained. It was the sound of a house realizing it could no longer protect its own illusions. The wives, who had once walked on eggshells around each other and their father, now had to confront not just him, but the reality that years of manipulation had been laid bare. One of the original wives, usually calm and measured, snapped a photo of a bank statement and said, quietly but with piercing authority, "This isn't about blame, this is about truth, and we owe it to ourselves to face it." And for the child, the moment was surreal. "I had been silent for 10 years," they wrote. "I had watched,